I said leave, Leona.
Now.
My father's voice cut through the dining room like a blade, sharp, cold, deliberate. I stood frozen beside the long polished table, my fingers trembling around the stem of my untouched glass of water. My chest was tight, like someone had wrapped steel cables around my ribs and started twisting. All eyes were on me, my stepmother Maureen's smug smile twitching, my older brother Trevor sneering with his arm draped lazily over the back of his chair, and even my baby sister Paige, who didn't even try to hide her smirk as she pulled her phone out to record. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're kicking me out?"
Now.
Dad's eyes didn't even flinch. "You're nothing but a burden. Always have been. You've done nothing with your life. You're 26, broke, and still chasing childish dreams. This family doesn't owe you a damn thing." It felt like the air had been punched out of me. The tension in the room didn't shift, it thickened. "You're pathetic," Trevor muttered with a chuckle, shaking his head like I was some sad joke. "Seriously, how are you even related to us?" I turned toward my father. "I left my job to take care of Mom when she was sick. I gave up everything." "Your mother is dead, Leona," Dad snapped. "Stop using that as an excuse for your failure. She's not here to cover for you anymore." Something in me cracked. I looked at the portrait on the wall, above the fireplace. My real mom. Not Maureen. Not the woman who slipped into her place like she'd always belonged there. Mom's soft brown eyes smiled in the painting, forever gentle, forever kind. She would never have let this happen. I blinked away tears and tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. "I'm not staying here another night," I whispered. "I don't want your money. I never did." Dad chuckled. "Good. Because you're not getting any. Trevor's the one getting everything when I'm gone. He's proven himself."
"You?"
"You're dead weight." Trevor raised his glass like he was already celebrating. "That's right," Dad continued, gesturing toward the rest of the table. "This is my legacy. These are my children. You," he pointed at me like I was dirt on his shoe, "were a mistake." I stood there. No one stopped him. No one stood up for me. Not even Paige. "Get out," he said again, calm and firm. "And don't come back." I should have cried. I should have begged. But I didn't. I straightened my spine, pushed back the burning in my chest, and looked each of them in the eye. "I'm not the one who's going to regret this," I said softly. And then I walked out. Into the cold night. Into nothing. No money. No home. Just a small overnight bag I had packed for the weekend visit, and a bank account balance that barely had enough to get me through the week. But I wasn't going to beg. Not them. Not ever again. And none of them knew the one thing that would change everything. The will wasn't finalized yet. Mom's will. And in less than 48 hours, the lawyer would read it aloud, with every single one of them present. I didn't know what was in it, but I knew my mother.
And she had always seen me. The real me.
The girl no one at that table ever truly understood. The girl who was about to burn their fake little kingdom to the ground. I spent the night in the back seat of my car. It was parked on the far end of a gas station lot, under a flickering street lamp that buzzed like a mosquito in my ear all night. The engine was off, the air was cold, and the only thing keeping me warm was the hoodie I'd forgotten to return to my ex 6 months ago. The smell of him still clung to it, stale and faint. I tried not to breathe too deeply. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad's face, stoic, cruel, and heard his words again. "You're a burden." It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but it was the first time he'd said it with so much finality and with an audience. I was humiliated, angry, hurt, but I wasn't broken. By sunrise, I was sitting on the curb sipping a bitter gas station coffee, scrolling through job boards and praying for anything that would pay by the hour. I couldn't afford to wait for dreams anymore. Not after being thrown to the curb by my own blood. That's when the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, and for a moment I almost ignored it. But something in me said to pick it up. "Leona speaking," I answered, trying to sound normal. A voice crackled on the other end. "Hi, this is Andrea Holt. I'm the attorney overseeing Margaret Flynn's estate. Your mother." My breath caught. "Yes," I said slowly. That's me. I wanted to remind you the will reading is tomorrow at noon. Your father and siblings have confirmed their attendance. I'll be there, I said immediately. There was a pause. Then her voice softened. She requested you sit beside me when I read it. My throat tightened. She did.
Yes.
She left specific instructions. There's a sealed letter she wanted you to open before I begin. I clutched the phone tighter, blinking fast. Okay. Thank you. When the call ended, I sat motionless for a long while. A sealed letter. Something told me this wasn't going to be a typical will reading. My mom had never been one for silence. Even from the grave, she was still trying to speak. The next morning, I walked into the lawyer's office, wearing the only decent clothes I had left, a plain navy blue dress I'd bought years ago for a college event, paired with scuffed black flats. I'd pulled my hair into a low bun and tried to conceal the dark circles under my eyes with a drugstore concealer. It didn't help much. As soon as I stepped inside the sleek glass conference room, every head turned. Trevor's eyes widened, then narrowed. Paige whispered something to Maureen and burst into laughter. Dad? He just stared at me like I was a ghost who had the nerve to rise. I thought I told you never to come back, he muttered. I'm not here for you, I said simply. Andrea, the lawyer, stood and gave me a warm, knowing smile. Leona, right on time. Please sit here. Right beside her. Directly across from my father. He looked like he'd bitten into something rotten. This is ridiculous, Trevor said, throwing his arms up. She doesn't even belong here. Mom barely tucked her at the end. Why is she sitting there? Andrea didn't even flinch. Because your mother requested it. Everything that happens in this room is per her explicit instructions. Silence. Andrea reached into her briefcase and pulled out a cream envelope, sealed with red wax. My name was written on it in soft, slanted handwriting. My heart jumped. I hadn't seen her handwriting in almost 2 years. She passed the letter to me. Go ahead. She wanted you to read it before I begin. My hands shook as I broke the seal. I unfolded the letter. And the moment I saw her words, I felt her. My dearest Leona, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're in a room full of people who probably wish you weren't there. But I need you to stay, sweetheart. No matter what happens, no matter what they say. I've spent my whole life watching you fight to be seen, to be heard,
To be loved.
and they never gave you what you deserved.
So I'm going to do it for them.
Everything will make sense soon.
Just trust me.
I love you.
Mom.
My hands were trembling. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, blinking away tears. I didn't look up when Trevor scoffed. Oh, please. Crocodile tears? What did she write? A goodbye love note. Andrea cleared her throat. Let's begin. The will reading began like any other, legal jargon, clauses, formalities.
But then she paused.
And now, Andrea said, her tone suddenly sharper, we move on to the personal distribution of assets as outlined by Margaret Flynn. Dad straightened. Trevor leaned forward. Trevor Flynn, Andrea read. To you, my eldest son, I leave the vintage car collection in the West Garage and a savings account in your name totaling $20,000. Trevor blinked. That's it. Paige sat up straighter. Wait, that's all he gets? Andrea didn't pause. Paige Flynn, to you I leave my jewelry collection, excluding the emerald pendant, which is to remain in the family vault. Paige made a sound like someone had slapped her. That's all? The jewelry? Are you kidding me? My father's face was slowly turning red. And, to my husband Alan Flynn, everyone went silent. Andrea looked him straight in the eye. I leave nothing. The room exploded. What? Dad stood up, knocking over his chair. What the hell is this? You hurt her, Andrea said calmly. She left nothing to you. Trevor jumped up. This has to be a mistake.
She wouldn't do this.
You need to recheck the will. It's all here in writing, Andrea replied, flipping to the signed page with the notary's stamp. And finally, she said, turning to me, to my daughter Leona. The room fell into a tense silence. I leave my entire estate, including the family home, all accounts and savings, the vineyard property in Italy, and my shares in the publishing company. I froze. What? I whispered. Total value estimated at just under $12 million, Andrea added. Trevor's mouth dropped open. Maureen turned sheet white. Paige let out a strangled, "No way." But it was my father who shattered the silence. "This is a lie," he thundered. "She would never do this."
Not to me.
"I took care of her." Andrea pulled out another piece of paper. "And yet," she said coolly, "here's a signed letter from your wife, outlining your infidelity, financial misconduct, and psychological abuse, along with documentation provided by a private investigator she hired." She slid the letter across the table. My father's hands were shaking. "You ruined everything," he whispered at me. I met his stare with something I hadn't felt in years. Power. "No," I said softly. "You did." And for the first time, no one laughed at me. No one scoffed. They were all too busy unraveling. "You planned this," Trevor muttered, glaring at me like I'd just stolen his entire future. "No," I said calmly. "Mom did." Andrea stood. "The will is final. If anyone attempts to contest it, we will proceed with the evidence outlined in Mrs. Flynn's attached documentation." She handed me a folder. "You may want to read this in private, Leona. Your mother left detailed letters and records for you." I nodded, clutching it like it was armor. "You're not walking out of here with my house," Dad growled, stepping forward. Andrea's voice cut him off. "Sir, if you do not leave peacefully, I'll call security." His jaw clenched. For a second, I thought he might explode. But then, with a bitter glare, he turned to me. "She's made a huge mistake," he hissed. "You're not built for this kind of power." "No," I replied, staring him dead in the eye. "But I'm built for surviving you." He scoffed and stormed out. Trevor and Paige followed, too stunned to say much more. Only Maureen lingered. "She hated me, didn't she?" she asked softly, her mask finally cracking. I gave her a long look. "She pitied you." Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing and left. Andrea put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded. "I will be." I spent the next few days going through Mom's letters. She had written everything. The emotional abuse, the lies, the favoritism, even the little moments, how she used to hear me cry in the attic room while they celebrated downstairs. How she'd always hoped I'd forgive her for staying quiet. She hadn't been able to protect me in life, but in death, she'd made it right. One letter stood out most. The last one. "Leona, use this second chance. Build a life for yourself. Not for revenge. Not for them. But for you. There is still kindness left in the world. You just have to be brave enough to offer it first. Love always."
Mom.
I cried reading that. Not out of grief, but because someone had finally, truly seen me. Weeks passed. I didn't throw anyone out of the house. I didn't shut off their accounts or rub their downfall in their faces. But I did change all the locks. I hired a small team to help manage the estate, focused on restoring the vineyard, and started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. Then one night, I got a knock at the gate. It was Paige. Alone. No makeup. No phone in hand. Just tears in her eyes. "Can I come in?" she whispered. I paused. Then, opened the gate. We sat in silence at the kitchen table. The same table where my father once laughed in my face. Only now it was just me and Paige. And she looked small.
Tired.
A shadow of the proud girl who once filmed me getting thrown out. "I didn't know she left everything to you," she said quietly, picking at the sleeve of her hoodie. "We all thought she'd split it. Or give it to Dad." "You were okay with that?" I asked, folding my arms. She sighed. "Honestly, I didn't think about it. I guess I just assumed I'd get something. We all did. But seeing him lose everything, watching Trevor spiral, and Dad drink like he's dying, I started to realize how broken we all are." I didn't respond, because part of me still didn't trust her. "I came here," she added, her voice shaking, "because I wanted to say I'm sorry." I looked at her. "I was cruel," she whispered. "I watched them tear you apart, and did nothing. I laughed at you. But You never deserved any of that." The tears welled up again in her eyes. I didn't rush to comfort her. I just sat there, watching the moment unfold. Watching her confront something she'd never had to before, accountability. And slowly, she looked up at me. "Do you hate me?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "But I don't trust you. Not yet." She nodded, wiping her face. "That's fair." Another pause. "I want to get better," she said softly. "I want to fix things." My mom's letter echoed in my mind. There is still kindness left in the world. You just have to be brave enough to offer it first. I exhaled. "You can stay for dinner," I said finally. No promises beyond that. Her eyes lit up, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something real in her. The next few days brought more shocks. Trevor was arrested for attempting to liquidate one of Mom's old accounts, one that was legally frozen after her death. Fraud, identity theft, and financial misconduct. The golden boy was crumbling. Dad had left town, drained, angry, and paranoid. Andrea called to tell me he'd tried to challenge the will, but gave up when the court presented the PI's evidence. Everything was unraveling. And yet, I was just beginning. I didn't go after them. I didn't need to. Their downfall wasn't revenge. It was justice. The truth was enough. And I was too busy building something better. Something mine. One morning, a letter arrived at the house. Handwritten. From a woman I didn't know. "Dear Leona, your mother once helped my family when we had nothing. She sent groceries anonymously. Paid my son's medical bills. She told me once that her daughter had the kindest heart she'd ever seen, and that one day, the world would finally see it too. I think that day is now." I clutched the letter to my chest, breath shaking. Mom never told me any of this. She hadn't just left me the house or the money. She left me her legacy. And it was finally mine to live out. A few months later, the house no longer felt like his house. It felt like mine. The dusty portraits came down. The cold colors were replaced with warm ones. The silent halls now had music, soft jazz in the mornings, my favorite records at night. It was still big, still too grand for someone like me, but I was learning to grow into the space, not shrink inside it. The vineyard was thriving again. I'd hired a kind, hardworking team who cared more about the craft than the profit. One of the older workers, Mr. Gallo, had been with Mom for years. When I introduced myself, he wiped his hands on his overalls and said, "You look just like her. But you've got more fight in you." I smiled. Because he was right. I'd been stepped on for years.
Dismissed.
Cast out by the very people who were supposed to protect me. But now, I had something stronger than vengeance.
Peace.
And purpose. Then, one crisp fall afternoon, I saw him again.
Dad.
Standing at the gate like a ghost, unshaven, thinner, his eyes sunken and hollow. I could have ignored him. I could have called security. But I walked out. He didn't speak at first. Then, "You look like your mother." "I know. I lost everything," he muttered. "The house, the cars, even Trevor doesn't talk to me anymore." I said nothing. "I wanted to hate you," he admitted. "I still don't understand why she gave it all to you." I looked him in the eye, steady. Because she knew I wouldn't waste it. His lips twitched. He almost smiled. Almost. Guess she was right. I waited. He shifted awkwardly. "I don't want money. I know better now. I thought maybe you'd want to know that I'm sorry." I studied him. The lines on his face. The cracks in the armor. He wasn't the tyrant anymore. Just a man with nothing left but regret. "I don't forgive you," I said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." He nodded slowly. "But I don't hate you either." He looked surprised. "I learned something," I said. "Hate only poisons the person holding it. I've let go of a lot. For me." A long pause. "Thank you," he said quietly. I turned and walked back inside, closing the gate behind me. Weeks passed. Paige began volunteering at a shelter. We had dinner every Sunday. She still had work to do, so did I, but we were trying. And that mattered. I turned one of the spare rooms into a community writing space. A few local girls came by weekly. One of them reminded me of myself at 17, soft-spoken, invisible. But here she smiled. She laughed. I saw in her what Mom must have seen in me. One night, as the sun dipped behind the vineyard and bathed the sky in gold, I stood on the balcony and read her final letter again. Leona, they never saw you. But I always did. I didn't raise a burden. I raised a woman stronger than any man I've ever known. You are not what they said you were. You are not your failures. You are not your shame. You are not a mistake. You are everything good I ever did. Live loud. Live proud. And never dim yourself for people who wear shadows like armor. I love you, always.
Mom.
Tears slipped down my cheeks. But this time, they weren't from sadness. They were from healing. I wasn't the burden anymore. I was the beginning. And I was just getting started.